Vietnam ended officially in January last year, American troops were seen to go home, Mr. Nixon said it was peace with honor at last. And those of us who had reported the war through its longest years also went home. For as a news story, the whole boring mess of Vietnam was finished. So much for the fantasy. Since the Paris Agreement and the so-called ceasefire, more than 70,000 soldiers and civilians have been killed in Vietnam. But this film is not about the day-to-day slaughter of soldiers. It's about the continuing and growing and forgotten suffering of the Vietnamese people in what is still, almost incredibly, America's war.
On the streets, the Americans appear to have gone. They haven't. The Pentagon has thousands of men in Vietnam. They include senior officers, pilots, and technicians, many of them disguised as civilians and embassy officials. American military headquarters is now called the Defense Attaché's Office and functions almost exactly as it did before the Paris Peace Agreement. But the majority of Americans in Vietnam, without whom the war could not go on, are servicemen who have transferred directly to the payroll of some 60 American companies on contract to Washington.
Some of them have been here 8 and 10 years, you know. Their contract normally runs on when they're working for a contractor, usually run a year, but most of the people have been here a number of years, 3 years or over.
People who've transferred from the army and then gone on to contract work.
Many of them in that category.
What were you doing in the Air Force?
I was working on an electronic countermeasure system.
What is that in plain language?
In plain language, that means a device that will let you know that a radar is looking at you, and it will let you know that that is happening.
A surveillance device.
Basically, a surveillance device.
Yes. And that's the extension of that is the kind of work you do now.
Yes.
So what would happen if the Vietnamese didn't have the surveillance assistance, didn't have the American assistance now?
I'd say within a week to possibly a month, North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would probably overrun this country very easily.
Who are the American pilots that fly the planes first and train them? Are these military people?
No, civilians from these aircraft companies like Lockheed and Northrop. Yeah.
They build the F-5. GE makes the engine for it, and they know the aircraft, so
They fly the aircraft.